This is Michael Popok, LegalAF, talking about the Tyre Nichols death, prosecution by the state, by Shelby County for state crimes, including second-degree murder of at least the 5 officers who beat him senseless in a depraved act of inhumanity, leaving him with severe kidney damage and having suffered a heart attack and dying about 3 days after that beating 100 yards from his mother's house. Where do the federal government and the Department of Justice come in? Are they important here? The answer to that is they are. They are for a number of reasons. It's not that we don't trust Shelby County prosecutors, who so far have done the right thing. Even the lawyer that represents Tyre Nichols' family, the renowned civil rights attorney Ben Crump, has praised how quickly the Memphis police force leadership and the prosecutors have moved on this case, having gotten an indictment within 3 weeks of the death of Tyre Nichols. So what role does the Department of Justice have? Well, it has a civil rights division, and it has to ensure that the rights of Americans are not deprived by law enforcement. And we will never get reform of law enforcement. We're not talking about defunding the police. We're talking about needed reform in law enforcement, national guidelines and training and background checks and continuing education training throughout the life of the career of law enforcement to ensure that these things don't happen. We can't just throw up our hands and look for excuses. George Floyd caused his own death because all a lie. Ahmaud Arbery, was doing something inappropriate and running through the neighborhood when he was tracked down and killed like an animal by 3 white men. We can't keep making excuses. This had nothing to do with Tyre Nichols. He is a pure innocent in this case. Do you want to know what he was doing prior to getting into the car that fateful night before being beaten to death 100 yards from his mother's house where he lived? He was taking sunset photos at a local park. Sunset photos at a local park. Does this sound like somebody who needed to be executed by law enforcement on the side of a road? So any defenses that they think they're going to come up with are gone. But even if somehow they cobble together some sort of defense to the second-degree murder charge so far that's been brought against them by the Shelby County District Attorney, in which they face 15 to 60 years, the Department of Justice has to step in here. And they have announced as of Wednesday that they have opened a criminal investigation into the death. How did it happen on the side of the road? Why did it happen? And what does it mean about policing and justice in this country? Changes to policing is only going to come at the federal level. It's too patchwork to allow all of the different police departments and law enforcement in a state to kind of come together in some sort of national standard. It's not going to happen. It can only happen by the Department of Justice. And so they're stepping in. Their Civil Rights Division is going to work closely with the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Tennessee, a Biden appointee, Mr. Ritz, who is a Memphis-born and raised. Kevin Ritz spent an entire lifetime to date working for federal justice, working in the U.S. Attorney's Office, working his way up to being appointed the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Tennessee. And he said in his own statement that he had promised the family that he would lead a methodical, thorough investigation. No stone would be unturned, and he would take the facts wherever they led. And he ended his press conference and the announcement by saying that he wants the city to be where justice is done. Well, that's great that we have a stand-up U.S. attorney in Kevin Ritz in the Western District of Tennessee, thank God, a Biden appointee. But Main Justice out of Washington and the Civil Rights Division and all of their expertise also has to come into the case and work side by side with Mr. Ritz and his team to do justice in this city, to make sure that it's done for the family, for the rest of the citizens of Memphis, and for our democracy. Now, what would the charges be from the Department of Justice standpoint? We sort of have a blueprint for this from two recent and unfortunately two recent events that are similar to what's happened here. In December of 2021, George Floyd's murderer, former officer Derek Chauvin, pled guilty to deprivation of civil rights as a crime. The deprivation of civil rights under 18 U.S.C. Section 242 says that somebody is guilty of that if they willfully deprive under color of law, having a badge, somebody's constitutional right. So that fit that murder and that crime. And Chauvin pled guilty to that in December of 2021. We then have the matter of the death at the hands of 3 white men of the African-American jogger Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. A Georgia state jury already convicted those 3 men, but the federal government stepped in and brought hate crimes under federal statutes against them as well. And hate crimes generally are if the heinous act, in this case the murder, is motivated in whole or in part by animus towards a racial group, a person because of a sexual orientation or gender or handicap or race or national origin or anything like that. If that's even an ounce of the equation that's being used by the person to commit the crime, then you've now committed a hate crime also under federal statutes. Now, here it makes it a little bit difficult because as has been reported, I'm sure everybody knows by now, at least the 5 police officers that beat Tyre Nichols to death were black. But it doesn't let them off the hook. It doesn't mean that it couldn't be, because it's black on black, it can't be also a hate crime. If in the investigation that is going to be thorough and methodical, according to Mr. Ritz, U.S. Attorney Ritz, reveals these gentlemen harbor any racism towards their own people, or believed, and I don't know this yet, but I'm just throwing it out there as something to follow up on, somehow believed because of Mr. Nichols' appearance, because he was tall and thin, that maybe they thought he was not a straight man. Maybe they thought he was some sort of different sexual orientation than them. If that came into play, whether he was or he wasn't, doesn't matter. It matters to the person, of course. But, the fact that he was single living with his parents and had a child suggests otherwise. But perhaps those cops thought that something that was something that motivated them. And if that's the case, we have a hate crime investigation. It is more likely, based on the facts that we know as of right now, that the Department of Justice will bring charges against at least these 5 and probably 2 sheriff's deputies for civil rights, the deprivation of civil rights under color of law, because they all wore a badge. So therefore they all had the color of law element, and the civil rights of having life, liberty deprived, literally, because your life is snuffed away, is snuffed out. You have all the elements for that particular crime. And that could lead to a much higher sentence than the one in Shelby County and the state of Tennessee for second-degree murder, which is the charge on the state side. That carries a 15 to 60-year top end, whereas on the deprivation of civil rights federally, you could go for even up to life imprisonment. There are some rare circumstances where the death penalty is meted out at the federal level, but generally that's for when law enforcement has died as a result of some murder or homicide. Here, I don't see the factors that would give rise to death penalty, but at the very least, life imprisonment without possibility of parole on the federal side. And the way this would work is the prosecutors for the state and the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's Office, Western District of Tennessee, would work together to kind of sequence who's ready to go first, who gets their grand jury to indict first, and then they would sort of line up in sequence. Generally, states allow deference to the federal prosecutors to go first, but they may elect, because of nuances of Tennessee law that we're just getting our hearts and minds around now, and we'll report on LegalAF, that the better course for the state and for the prosecution is to allow the state to prosecute first, and we'll keep an eye on that. Who goes first? Now, these officers could always plead guilty. I don't really see defenses for them. I mean, their defense lawyers have all come out and said, no one that day expected Tyre Nichols to be murdered. Well, that may be, but at some point in the minds of these 5 officers, egged on by each other, with none of them stepping forward to protect and serve and give aid and comfort to Tyre Nichols, who they were beating, they're all guilty of that conspiracy on the federal side to deprive Mr. Nichols of his life and his civil liberty and his civil rights. So we have that going on. So what we need to follow now, and what we will follow on LegalAF, is this intersection of law and politics as it relates to police reform, the position of the Department of Justice in going after everyone involved in Tyre Nichols' death for the civil rights violations and potential hate crimes that they are, seeking plea deals and or convictions and sentencing at the highest level to run parallel to what is happening in Shelby County, but ensuring that these 5 animals that violated their oath, that violated their commitment as police officers to protect and serve, will never see the light of day again as free people. And that is the goal. The other side of the Department of Justice, which is different than Shelby County DA, is to use cases like this one. And it's hard to believe we're talking about this again. Last year we were talking about, Derek Chauvin and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. And just a year and a couple of months later, we're talking about the death of Tyre Nichols. But it is really only at the federal level where real change in policing can happen if people have the courage to do it. Press conferences are great. They're effective. They're important. The press conference with the mother and family brought a tear to everyone's eye when the mother said, when he cried out for a mother, no mother, she said, no mother should ever have to stand at a podium like this one and talk about these issues. And Mr. Crump, their lawyer, made an impassioned plea and also complimented Memphis' reaction to all of this from a prosecutorial standpoint. But it can't end there. It can't end with press releases on websites from the Department of Justice and from the Shelby County, prosecutors, and press conferences even by the family and their lawyers. We have to do better. We have to have political will. Where are the Republicans in Congress on this issue? They're quick to bring in, issues that they think are interesting, like let's talk about the Washington Guardians or the Washington, whatever the football team is called these days, and talk about their sexual harassment problems and do that at the federal level. Okay, that's interesting. But where is the House majority and all these committees that McCarthy has basically turned over to the right-wing MAGA? Where are they in conducting serious oversight and investigations into policing in this country? Almost every police department in this country gets federal funds for equipment, for supplies, for weaponry, for overtime, for various things. It's not just the state budget, the local budget, the county budget, the city budget. It's federal money that they apply for in grants and otherwise to support their SWAT teams, to have their emergency response vehicles and all of that. So there is a hook that they can use at the federal level to regulate in these areas if there is political will. We haven't seen it in the school shootings and the mass shootings around the country. There is no political will by the Republicans at all for sensible gun control. And it's the same issue on police, because they'd rather talk about crime and talk about, murder rates in major cities, which they then tie to Democrats and liberals, than do something about it. Now, of course, they have a situation that they don't really know how to respond to, because the murderers of Tyre Nichols were black and black officers. So it sort of removes from the equation, issues other than bad police, bad policing, bad police training caused the death of a pure innocent. And with that, we can only hope that a combination of some sort of leadership at a bipartisan level, if not in Congress, then in the democratically controlled Senate, combined with the Department of Justice, will finally bring real change so that a year from now or less, I'm not doing another hot take, or LegalAF is not talking about another and next Tyre Nichols and having to say his name. This is Michael Popok, LegalAF reporting.